quick background on me. I was a contractor before coming to Levelset. And then for years, I worked here with our team on lien rights. I've worked with thousands of contractors, subs, GCs, developers, to suppliers and equipment rental companies across the US with putting those kinds of systems and processes in place to protect their cash. And then now I am on our materials financing team where we put money out in the street to cover materials purchases for contractors when they need them at the start of the job, throughout projects, making sure that they can keep on working. And my email is right there. Obviously, if you guys have any questions after this, I will be available. Shoot me an email. If it's something from this or something that we don't cover, happy to talk to you guys about it. And without further ado, let's move into the actual content.
All right, we're keeping it rolling.
Oh, okay. Maybe not just yet. One more slide.
Almost.
But yes, yeah. But so that was my background, Levelset's background. As mentioned, we worked with thousands upon thousands of contractors, suppliers, equipment rental companies with their lien rights, making sure that their cash flow is covered, making sure that they have great risk reports on projects that they're setting up. And they know what they're walking into before they show up on site. Everything that touches how can we make sure that we've got cash on hand to keep moving. So if you're so inclined, go to levelset.com, which if you're here, you probably have, but keep using us. We've got plenty of free resources. Highly recommend that you use those to your advantage. So why is it so hard to stay cash positive in the first place? Well, it's because construction is hard. You guys know that. Up front, as I mentioned, like cash is king. Cash flow cannot be more important than anything else within construction besides the quality of the work that you're doing. Up front, contractors, subs, you have really steep costs before any work is even invoiced in the first place. It's where you have to have liquid cash to be able to cover, upfront materials purchases, permitting, some of the labor that might need to be done ahead of time. If it's AEC work, cash is king. So from there, like any kind of cash flow concern that we run into, it's going to start to snowball into something that leads to, I call it like a payment fire, but it's just going to continue to build throughout the course of the project. And then it's not going to end well. And I'm sure everyone here has their like horror story or versions of that they've come across. But like when everything does go right, so when it goes as well as it could possibly be imagined, the budget is already so tight and the margin is so thin that any small issue that we have avoided keeps us, consistent with what we're doing. But if we can avoid any of those hiccups along the way, then it's a repeatable process that we could use to keep building our cash position, which we could then use to reinvest back into the business or, increase our profits. So right here on the screen, this is like an illustration of really a simple construction project. And from the get-go, this kind of lays out what we're dealing with when it comes to the exchange of documents back and forth, cash being, trickled down through, I call it like the payment chain, to where obviously starting with a lender and owner goes down to the GC. They need to pay their subs pay subs. They all need to pay their vendors on time. But at the same time, those subs need to have either a deposit with some of their suppliers. There's a specialty material that there's a 6-week lead time on, and they need a deposit to get started on that. But they haven't been paid yet because the draw hasn't been put out to where they can pay their vendors on time. I'm going around in the circle talking, but the point is it's complicated. There's a lot of back and forth transactions and interactions with like pay applications, lien waivers, change orders that are constantly revolving throughout the life cycle of a project. And every single time those are exchanged, it gives you, not you in particular, but it gives room for error or gives room for maybe a misunderstanding that can snowball into something bigger. So really what we want to do, and we're going to focus more on this as we get into some of the solutions, is building processes that can be repeated over and over again. And we understand that each project is different and we want to account for that. So the areas that we can all recognize that can be the same, let's have a standard process in place. That way it's taken out of the equation. And the more that that's done, the more consistent we can be from project to project, and more consistent we can be with our cash on hand. So if you could go to the next slide, Kara. So up front, some of the most common things that you're going to run into that tend to be a pain. If you want to click on that next one, high payroll, this isn't going to change. That's going to be a significant chunk of where your money is going out every week, every 2 weeks, every month. And especially, the higher quality work you want to do, the better kind of employees that you want to have in your employ, you're going to need to have compensation for those folks. Bills and budgeting, this is everything from your standard overhead running the business itself to how do we budget for the next project, and then budget for what we're trying to bid and what we're trying to win. And then eventually is just the slow paying customers. And this can start at the very, very top with the end owner of the project, but this can also be other contractors involved throughout the project that are delaying it for the folks underneath them. And then like on top of this, when we look at, we've got thin margins, it's not listed here, but like the volatility with the change in materials, meaning the prices involved, to where everyone knows what's going on over the last year with COVID, the supply chain's backed up. Over the last year, I was reading that like materials costs have increased about 25 to 26% on average, but at the same time, the average bid price has increased about 5%. So what we're losing on the rising material costs is not really being accounted for in the bid price, because we're trying to stay competitive. We're trying to still win projects. That makes our margins even thinner than they have been. So again, I'm going to keep harping on this, like being consistent with what we're doing from job to job is going to make it to where we can slowly start to build up our cash position. So let's get into some of the things we can do. So lien rights, consistency, again, I'm going to hammer that, and then financing or mobilization. I'm not really going to go in order here. I'm going to start off with mobilization. So there's a few different ways that we can get ready for the start of a project. How can we have cash on hand to cover what we need to get going? Pretty obvious one is, hey, we need some kind of deposit from that customer, which can lead to pushback from them, whether that's, we'd rather go with a bid that is not asking for money down from us. That way you guys can start doing the work. But at the same time, having that put into the contract where you have secured cash up front to cover those initial costs, great thing. But they're all going to have the cons that come along with how are we going to get that cash up front. The next one, pretty obvious. Everyone in this room has dealt with this, is just using the credit lines that your vendors give you. At least with this, it can delay the payments that you need to make to your vendors for the materials that you need to get started up front, which is great initially, but like the downside to me, and I see it over and over again, to where we do every year we do a it's like a construction cash flow survey that goes out to all the folks that we work with, and on average, it's 65 to 70 days to get paid for your typical like subcontractor, and with everyone here in the webinar, I don't know how many of you have terms with your suppliers where they would match up with that 60 to 75 days, to where you're having to still pay them at day 30, at day 15, or maybe you need to put that deposit down to start the order. So it still doesn't sync up with when you're actually being paid, and you're going to have to float some of the cash on hand for that project or from other projects to be able to get those materials paid on time. But at least it gives you something up front. And something that we've been doing to address this, which I'm going to dig into, but it's not the only way to look at the problem, is the financing for materials up front. So when we do that, we can cover the cost of the materials, pay those suppliers immediately. So they're set up, they're fine. And then at the same time, we could give folks like, who needs that done 120 days to pay us back, which doesn't usually go 120 days, but it's really more of trying to sync up paying your debts when you're actually being paid for your work. And this can be done with a line of credit with your bank. This could be done with traditional construction loans. Our thing is it's just materials focused, while those other things could be applied towards labor and other costs as well. And then with that, like, you use it to your advantage to where every job's going to be different, and some you might not need that financing for the materials or for the labor costs, but when you get the right one, you can write them into the bid up front, have it paid for. Or if we're buying those materials from the contractor, I mean, not from the contractor, from the supplier, and it's going to be paid for up front. Let's see what kind of negotiations we can make on the cost of materials if there's a guaranteed payment for them and zero risk involved with the vendor overall. So start just kind of like playing around with how you could use that cash on hand. But really, it's just to be able to have the upfront cost covered and then keep you liquid for the costs that can really, vary week to week, like payroll, with overtime or with change orders coming in. And then when we start talking about, I guess, change orders is a good way to do it. Change orders, they happen on every single project. Not every single one. That was kind of, it was an exaggeration, but they happen. And you guys know that they happen. Yeah. So they're going to be frustrating, and they're not always accounted for in the initial cost of the project. So as a best practice, it's really, we want to communicate and have it in writing up front. How are they going to be addressed? How are they going to be documented? How are they going to be accounted for? And by doing that, you're really going to try to avoid many situations down the road where that's where disputes happen. They're around the change orders and the costs involved and the changing overall cost of the project. So creating a consistent approach to the start of every job, documenting this is how they will be handled, this is how they will be compensated for, this is how they will be addressed. And it's not something that's being dictated, but it's about opening up that conversation and being proactive with that customer, with that contractor, to say this is how it should be handled. In a similar vein, we also have retainage. So can be held on a lot of construction projects. There's a few states like Texas where it's required to be held. A lot of times that is the profit for a contractor. And it's tough when you see people just agree to the retainage terms on good faith, not really in writing. Like, every state has a set allotted amount of time for how long they can hold your retainage once you've completed your work or the project as a whole has been completed. So again, having that upfront in writing, in agreement with your customer, with the owner of the project, because that's a delay that gives you your profit after the project's complete. And a lot of times that's what you're going to need to be able to keep winning the jobs that are next on the horizon. Another thing, when we talk about bad faith is maybe the wrong term, but just something to avoid when you can is pay when paid clauses or pay when paid contracts, because they make sense where you're like, okay, well, obviously you guys can't pay me until you have the money to pay me from the draw being dispersed or from the owner or whatever the case is. But what they're doing is they're time shifting when they're able to pay you. And by doing that, they're really just transferring all the risk of non-payment down the chain. And that's when we talk about the snowball situations, that's one of the cases where they happen really quickly, where it sends a shock all the way down the payment chain where no one's getting paid when they should be. And then it reaches the vendor, then demand letters start flying, liens start coming on the property early, and then it just starts to be a tangled mess. So when possible, just try to push for, pay if paid, if anything. But yeah, try to avoid the pay when paid contracts if possible. No, that's not always the case. Finally, we have lien rights. So I know a lot of contractors, like, you never walk onto a site and think, I can't wait to lean this job. Last furthest thing from your mind, really, you're focused on the work. You're focused on doing the best job that you can do with your trade, with the project, and making sure that you're compensated for it. But lien rights are a fickle thing to where every single state is going to be different. And then within that, every single project is going to be different, whether it's a residential job, a commercial job, public job, federal. They're all going to have different requirements up front. They're just going to ask you to protect your ability to lien. That doesn't mean that you intend to actually lien the property further down the road. Doesn't intend or mean that you intend to be aggressive on the project. You're really just wearing your seatbelt. So as we know that it's important for every job, it's something to where when you start to understand what's required for those projects, what's required for your state or the multiple states that you work in, then it's about starting a standardized process of, okay, within the first 10 days, we need to send out this first document. Once that's out the door, we're going to be monitoring the rest of the project and the deadlines involved, and then have someone in the office that has ownership of that process. And this is really important because, for one, the more you do of the very first step, so just protecting your ability to lien, the less and less likely you're ever going to run into the lien itself outside of really crazy circumstances. And by that, I mean, so I'm down here in New Orleans, and almost 3 years ago now, we had Hard Rock, not casino, but it was a hotel collapse halfway through the project. Yeah, that's a situation where just about everyone's going to have to be filing a lien, and it had no part to do with bad faith on, hey, I'm trying to stiff you. But if we're doing the right things consistently at the start of every project, we're communicating them with our customers, with our vendors, the less likely we're going to be running into trouble on the back end. And then when we're doing those the right way, and a payment fire does happen, we know we're in the right position to collect on it. We know we have valid lien rights, and then that avoids really costly lawsuits, just flat out being burned, or just the complete and total delay of payment. So really, my thing, to make it even more simple, is just like, look at the avenues you have to have cash available up front, whether that's through using your vendors, through using your customer for deposits, for using capital resources like materials financing, credit lines at the bank, traditional construction loans. Being consistent with how you're communicating on the project up front when it comes to change orders, when it comes to lien rights, when it comes to your retainage. And when you have those all be standard processes that you can repeat over and over again, that's when we can start building and building our cash advantage to where we can reinvest it back into the business, into our marketing, into our labor force, into new equipment so we can take on larger projects. So that's the take. Kara, yeah, I'm kind of wrapping up here, but I think we have some questions next, or if anything came in through the chat, I'd be happy to talk about those.
I'm not quite seeing anything through the chat yet, but one thing that did come to mind was, I know you mentioned some of the things about financing and some of the other options like line of credit. Like one thing that we didn't touch on was factoring, and what the difference between like factoring and like financing your materials for specific jobs. Do you mind kind of touching on that for a second, just so we understand the differentiators?
Yeah, I won't get too deep into it, but factoring is buying an invoice that's already been sent out, while with the financing of the materials, we're paying the invoice right when it's issued. So it's already been underwritten and it's understood the risk involved, and then we're going to cover it right away. While factoring, that contractor, receives the invoice, they have the materials sent, then they hand that invoice over to the factoring company, which will then pay it and then own the debt. So factoring tends to be a little bit more aggressive because they haven't taken into account a lot of the risk ahead of time, which I'm painting with a broad brush right now, but it tends to be more aggressive because it's a little bit more risky from the
Yeah,
factoring company's perspective.
got you. Okay, that was perfect. You're doing a great job at keeping things very concise. Thank you, Pierson. We did
I
get a
talk
question.
fast. I talk fast. I'm sorry, everybody. That's just how I grew up. I talk fast. So if you need me to shut up and slow down, tell me.
No, you're good. And the good news is this recording will go out to everyone, whether they attended or just registered. So they can listen and pause and rewind and go back as much as they need to. So we did have a question come through from Gina, and she says, State of California, are pre-liens suggested to be filed upon receipt of LOI or upon executed contract? Is that something you could speak to?
Yeah. And so after this, Gina, we can send you over, like our CEO, when we started Levelset, he decoded the states, not the states, all of the states, lien laws. We have them all spelled out like in plain English. So you're not just looking at like subsection, barcode this to tell you what's required. My general rule of thumb is that you can send them early, up to maybe 2-3 weeks before you step site on the project. But when the official like deadline, the ticker starts counting down, is as soon as you step on site, for labor, for materials to start the project itself, you have 20 days to send out that pre-lien. So as long as you have that in mind, you're fine. But yes, California is a state where you can send it earlier than that, as long as you just know when that deadline actually starts. It's when you arrive on site. And not walking the site to see what we're going to do, but to actually start the work.
Great. She said thank you. Awesome. Okay, so I am going to move on to this screen just so everyone has the opportunity to jot down your contact info, Pierson. And but we do still have a couple of minutes. So does anyone have any lasting questions? Okay. Nicole asked if we could talk a little bit more about terms and rates for material financing.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm not going to give you the blanket rates because, well, the reason is we do it differently on each project. So at least with our materials financing, we're using our expertise in lien rights first and foremost to see how safe, how risky a job is to finance. So this means that folks with bad credit or lack of credit because they're a new business, or they're came from a really small business to now they've got actual business accounts. That's not as big of a deal to us as it would be to traditional lenders or financing institutions. So if we look at the project that someone needs finance for materials, and we see that your lien rights are intact, we see that our lien rights are intact because we basically become the supplier at that point, then we feel really comfortable with our ability and our expertise in lien rights to make sure that, for one, you get paid for the work that you've done, which then enables you to pay us back. So for right now, it's a pretty low monthly rate, and that's the ceiling. So it's 3% a month for 120 days until we're paid back. But that really fluctuates, and by fluctuate, I don't mean up or down. I really just mean down, depending on how healthy that project looks. So is the GC running it? Do they have a great reputation? Are there existing liens on the property? That kind of stuff. So let's say 3% a month for now, until it's paid back. So if we're paid back at day 30, it's just that 3%, we're done. But yeah, it gets lower than that depending on the risk and the health of the project itself. Thanks everyone for attending.